continue in this study, going together, walking through Scripture, trying to really understand from God's truth what it looks like to form a genuine community where we are real with one another in an authentic way, united in the gospel and our love for God and our love for one another. The past couple of weeks have been very just foundational theology kind of stuff, but this week we're getting into something much more practical. And actually, for the rest of this book, it's really going to push us to really think much more into the detail. Okay, what does this actually look like for us in our community, in our group together? And 1 Corinthians 13 is really getting into that big answer of what we do together. And it really is all about love. So walking through this book, I just want to highlight the things for each of the 4 days before the final. So what does a spiritual family do is the question that we ask. And the first thing we looked at is it pursues the one another's together. The one another's, there's, I think, dozens of unique ones, but there's 100 different times throughout the New Testament where that phrase "one another" is there. So it's like love one another, forgive one another, bear one another's burdens, care for one another, weep with one another. All those kinds of ideas are throughout the New Testament of what it looks like, this community together. And that's something that we should pursue. In 1 Peter passages there, it highlights several of them. And then the second day, we looked at Ephesians 4, and there's that idea of speaks the truth in love together. And I just love that because we are studying and we're pursuing God's truth in His Word. We're letting His Word and His truth abide in us, and we're abiding in it. And then that allows us to interact with that truth with others, and we do that in love. It's the truth plus love. I remember hearing a pastor a long time talk about this idea of how truth and love have to be together. And the way he said it is that if you have love without truth, then all it is enablement. If you have truth without love, then all you are is a hammer. You're just hitting people over the head with truth. And so the combination of those two things, where in love we speak the truth to one another, and that is part of the process of growing, where we, a brother or sister that we're close to, where we confront them with God's truth, but we do it in a loving way that's about their good and about growing them and helping them to be a better person. Then the third day, we looked at this amazing passage in Acts chapter 4, super radical. This idea of being an inconvenience for one another. The church described in Acts 4 is unbelievable. Read it again if you haven't read it recently, but this idea of I will set down whatever I have for the betterment of other people. And it said that, I forget the exact phrase, but it's something like everyone within that community lacked nothing. And the reason was because if you had, you sold it and you gave to the person with need. I mean, that was how radical their care was for one another. And then the fourth day, in James 5, it guards and grows the flock. So we're realizing that there are wolves out there that are trying to get into the sheep pen. And that's something that we do together to protect one another. And then finally, we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And what does a spiritual family do? We love one another. And this is the famous love passage. You'll hear this 1 Corinthians passage read a lot of times at weddings, even though it has nothing really to do at all with romance and romantic love. Although the agape love of Scripture is a foundational part of a marriage for sure, but it goes with all relationships. So we're going to back up to the last verse of chapter 2. It says, "And I will show you a still more excellent way." Because remember, before he was talking about, in chapter 12, spiritual gifts and talents and abilities that God's given us to minister to one another. And in some spiritual gifts that God's given, like gifts of healing and prophecy and these things that He's given much more in the past, can be really incredible, like the kind of thing that you tell stories about. But He's about to share something that is even more excellent than that. Starting in chapter 13, he says, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." Just think about that contrast. "And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing." Paul is rhetorically using a device here to show us these extremes, just to make it clear that don't tell me how impressive your abilities are or your ministry is for God. If you have not love, none of that matters. That's how significant and important love is. And if I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. And so I think the way I would summarize that first section is there's nothing greater. There's absolutely nothing greater than love. You know, we have a resume of accomplishments that we've done. You know, you think about the work that you do to try to build a resume so that you can have, attractive, skill set and accomplishments to get a better job, to get paid more, all those kinds of things. And then contrast your resume with usually what we hear from eulogies at funerals, at memorial services. Nobody at funeral services talks about accomplishments. It's all about their care, about their love for people, what they sacrifice, the people that they've impacted in their life. So I really want to live my life with that eulogy in mind, not the resume in mind. And Paul's saying that here as well in this first section. Nothing is better. You know, don't tell me about how impressive your accomplishments are and what you can do, and even if you're doing things for God and His kingdom. If you don't have love, those things are nothing. This is the greatest thing there is. Now, this next section, he begins to define love. And you guys know that in the Greek language, there were 3 different words for the word love. We say one word love, and they had agape love, they had phileo love, which was brotherly love, and they had eros love, which is romantic love. So this is all about agape. It's a particular kind of love. In our culture, we say, oh, I love that pizza. I love this person. Or, I met this person and then I fell in love. I was just overwhelmed with these emotions and feelings for this person. None of that, none of those kinds of love are the love that's described here. The love of agape love is self-sacrifice love for the betterment of other people, which means that it even can apply to enemies, to people that are hurting us. So he begins to define this. And one of the things I'd love for you guys to do as a group is just talk about the idea of biblical agape love and make sure that we have a really good handle as a group about the difference between God love, agape love, and the other kinds of love, which are good things that God's made, but let's not confuse the two of them together. So he begins to define a little bit in the next section. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And here's my summary. Love is the expression of God's goodness. Those few verses, he's expressing and describing what love is, but it is not at all an exhaustive list. You've got to look at all of Scripture. You've got to look at the acts of God. You've got to look at, most importantly, the act of God's love through the gospel of Jesus Christ and the cross, crucified on our behalf as enemies. So he laid his life down for his enemies. That's agape love. So when we are loving one another the way God's called us to love one another, we are expressing the goodness of God. In the same way that God's loved us, we love other people. So talk through that a little bit more. What does that look like? And again, it's not based on like, man, I really like that person and I really enjoy being with that person. And, all the kinds of things that, again, they're good things. They're good things, but they are not the same as agape love. And I think a lot of times I find myself doing this all the time where I love to love people that love me back the way I like to be loved, and I love to give where I can get in return. All those kinds of ideas, which is really a different kind of love. It's different than the agape kind of love, which is really about self-sacrifice for the betterment of others. But you guys can talk about that and build that out a little bit more. 1 Corinthians 13, continuing on the last section, it says, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. And so he's kind of coming back to what he said at the very beginning. All the other works in God's kingdom that people do, those are all temporal things. There will be no need for prophets in God's kingdom. There will be no need for special revelation of his scripture in God's kingdom. But love is eternal. God has been loving for all eternity. He loves us today, and he will continue to love into eternity. So when you are doing what God is, you are doing the thing that is like lasting forever. Love will never cease. Verse 9, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. So he's just building on that idea he just shared. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. He's just explaining, I think, more of the specifics of why are we not going to need special revelation of Scripture? Why are we not going to need prophets? And the reason is because we're looking through we're looking at a mirror reflection of ourselves that doesn't have great clarity, and that's kind of like, in other words, we're seeing the world partially. Not everything's been fully revealed, but when God comes again and he restores everything and he removes all sin in the world, all darkness, all evil, even death itself, there'll be no need for those things because he's implanted all that we need in our hearts, and we're in perfect relationship with him and one another. So that's, I think, what that means. Verse 13, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Again, I think the big summary there is that love is forever. But the big idea to keep in mind is that love is really the greatest thing that there is that we do for one another. It is the expression of God's love, expression of God's goodness when we love one another. We're being like God in that way. So back to the original idea, what does a spiritual family do? A spiritual family loves one another. Love is I believe, the chief characteristic, the chief quality of who God is. Everything else that he does is a sub-point. It's a subcategory of his love. And that's why he says the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Love is the summation of God's ethic, of God's morality. And again, it's not brotherly love and it's not romantic love, although those are a part of God's love in the big picture. He's calling us to love one another in the way that he has loved us. So talk about that a little bit more, and what does that look like as a community together where we are choosing to love people, not because of what we can get returned or because of what we enjoy or what we like, but because of the way that God's loved us. We're going to love one another. So remember to listen to Jesus, do what he says, and know that you are loved.